Welcome, weary traveler, to the shadowed tale of one who walked between darkness and light for over 2 centuries. Tonight, we delve deep into the story of Astarion and Kunin, vampire spawn, survivor, and seeker of freedom. This is a journey through pain and healing, through masks worn and eventually discarded, through the long path from victim to someone choosing their own destiny. So settle in, let the gentle glow of distant campfires guide you, and allow yourself to drift as we explore the complete story of the pale elf who learned that true strength lies not in power over others, but in reclaiming power over oneself. The story of Astarion and Kunin begins not in the shadows where we would later find him, but in the vibrant streets of Baldur's Gate, in an age when the city's towers reached proudly toward the sky, and its markets bustled with honest commerce. Picture, if you will, a time before darkness claimed him, when the morning sun felt warm on pale elven skin, and the future stretched ahead like an unwritten scroll full of promise. Born in the year 209, Astarion came into the world as so many elves do, with the ancient wisdom of his people flowing in his veins, though not yet awakened to the memories of past lives that would one day guide him through the sacred ritual of the Reverie. His birth name, gifted to him by parents whose faces time would eventually steal from his memory, meant Little Star in the old tongue. It was a name that spoke of hope, of light piercing the darkness, of something small but brilliant that could guide travelers through the deepest night. The Baldur's Gate of Astarion's youth was a city of opportunity and ambition, where clever minds could rise through merit and determination. Unlike the elven enclaves hidden deep in ancient forests, the gate welcomed those who could contribute to its prosperity, regardless of their heritage. For a young elf with sharp wit and sharper tongue, it represented everything the wider world could offer: a chance to make his mark on history, to build something lasting beyond the cyclical nature of elven existence. Astarion threw himself into his studies with the passionate intensity that only the young possess. Lore fascinated him, not merely as a collection of rules and precedents, but as the very framework upon which civilized society rested. He saw in jurisprudence the power to shape lives, to protect the innocent, to ensure that justice flowed like water, finding its proper level. The idealistic young elf, who would one day learn the bitter taste of injustice, believed absolutely in the system he served. His rise through the ranks of Baldur's Gate's legal establishment came swiftly, propelled by a combination of natural talent and relentless effort. Colleagues respected his thorough preparation and incisive arguments. Citizens appeared before his bench, knowing they would receive a fair hearing from someone who understood that behind every case stood real people with real hopes and fears. By the time he had seen 39 years, still young by elven standards, though already a respected adult in human terms, Astarion had achieved a position that many spent lifetimes pursuing. As a magistrate, Astarion wielded considerable power within the city's judicial system. He presided over cases that ranged from petty disputes between merchants to serious crimes that threatened the peace of entire districts. His courtroom became known as a place where eloquence mattered as much as evidence, where a well-reasoned argument could sway outcomes, and careful attention to legal precedent ensured that justice was not merely arbitrary preference dressed in official robes. Yet for all his success in the human world of Baldur's Gate, Astarion remained fundamentally shaped by his elven nature. At 39, he stood at a crossroads that would never come, the approach to his 100th year, when elven society would recognize his full maturity and he would undergo the sacred calling of Reverie. This ancient ritual would unlock the memories of his past lives, connecting him to the continuous cycle of elven existence that stretched back through the centuries. The anticipation of this transformation colored everything about Astarion's young adult life. He knew that somewhere in those locked memories lay wisdom and experience that would fundamentally change how he viewed the world. The elf he was in 209 would, in a very real sense, cease to exist when the deeper memories awakened. He would become someone new, someone who had lived many lives and learned from countless experiences. This knowledge created a strange tension in his daily existence. The work he did, the relationships he built, the very identity he crafted, all of it was temporary, a prelude to the person he would truly become. Some young elves found this prospect terrifying. The idea that their carefully constructed sense of self was merely a chrysalis waiting to be shed. Others, like Astarion, found it exhilarating. The future promised transformation, growth, becoming more than he could imagine in his current limited existence. His chambers in the Hall of Justice became a sanctuary where ancient elven wisdom could coexist with human legal tradition. Scrolls containing precedents from centuries past shared shelf space with treatises on elven philosophy and meditation techniques. Astarion understood that his unique position, standing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, gave him perspectives that purely human judges might lack. The cases that came before his bench reflected the complex nature of life in a cosmopolitan city. Elves seeking justice for wrongs committed against them by humans who barely recognized their longevity and different customs. Humans struggling to understand why elven witnesses might remember events differently after experiencing reverie. Disputes that required not just knowledge of law, but deep understanding of how different peoples thought and felt and valued different aspects of existence. Astarion approached each case with meticulous care, recognizing that his decisions would ripple outward in ways he might never see. A merchant's contract dispute resolved fairly today might prevent a larger conflict tomorrow. A criminal sentenced appropriately might find redemption rather than deeper corruption. These were not abstract legal puzzles, but moments when the theoretical ideals of justice met the messy realities of life. His reputation grew steadily throughout his 30s, built on a foundation of fairness, intelligence, and an almost uncanny ability to see through deception. Lawyers who appeared before him learned to prepare thoroughly, knowing that half-truths and clever misdirection would not survive his careful questioning. Yet he was never cruel in his pursuit of truth, understanding that even those who bent facts often did so from desperation rather than malice. The other magistrates respected his dedication to the law's ideals rather than its convenience. In a system where influence and gold could sometimes purchase favorable outcomes, Astarion remained incorruptible. His chambers saw no midnight visitors bearing gifts, no whispered promises of future favor in exchange for present leniency. The integrity he displayed would later make his transformation into something darker all the more tragic. But perhaps what made Astarion most effective as a judge was his genuine empathy for those who appeared before him. He understood that behind every legal proceeding lay human stories of love, loss, ambition, and fear. The widow, seeking compensation for her husband's death in a construction accident, was not merely a plaintiff, but a person whose world had been shattered. The young thief brought before him for stealing bread was not just a criminal, but someone driven by circumstances that demanded understanding as well as justice. His elven heritage gave him a perspective on time that his human colleagues sometimes lacked, where they might see only the immediate consequences of their decisions. Astarion could envision how choices made today would echo through the decades and centuries to come. This long view made him cautious about precedents that might seem reasonable in the moment, but could create lasting problems for future generations. The tragedy that would end this promising life came not from any failing in Astarion's character, or judgment, but from the very qualities that made him an exemplary magistrate. His refusal to be bought, his insistence on following the law rather than political expedience, his determination to protect those who had no other advocate. These virtues made him enemies among those who preferred a more pliable judicial system. The group of nobles who would ultimately destroy him represented everything corrupt about power, unchecked by accountability. Wealthy, connected, accustomed to having their desires treated as commands. They viewed the legal system as a tool to be used rather than a principle to be honored. When their interests collided with justice, they expected justice to yield. Astarion's refusal to accommodate them was seen not as integrity, but as insolence that demanded correction. The specific case that sealed his fate has been lost to time and the subsequent chaos of his transformation, but the pattern was depressingly familiar. Powerful individuals sought to use the courts to legitimize something that violated both law and conscience. They expected their influence to purchase the outcome they desired. When Astarion refused to participate in their corruption, when he ruled according to law rather than pressure, they began to plot his destruction. They could have sought his removal through official channels, petitioning higher authorities or attempting to have him reassigned. But such methods would have been slow, public, and uncertain. These were people accustomed to taking what they wanted through more direct means. People who saw violence as simply another tool for achieving their goals. The attack came on a night when autumn was giving way to winter, when the streets of Baldur's Gate lay shrouded in the kind of cold mist that muffled sound and concealed movement. Astarion had stayed late in his chambers, working by lamplight to prepare for the next day's cases, unaware that his dedication to duty had made him an easy target for those who watched from the shadows. The alley where they cornered him was narrow and dark, the kind of place where honest citizens hurried through without looking too closely at what might be lurking in the deeper shadows. It was a place forgotten by the city's guards, ignored by its lighting, perfect for the kind of work his attackers had in mind. When they surrounded him, their faces hidden by hoods and darkness, Astarion understood immediately that this was no random robbery. The beating that followed was methodical, designed not just to kill but to send a message. Each blow carried the weight of aristocratic outrage at being denied what they considered their due. They wanted him to understand, in his final moments, exactly why he was dying, not for any crime he had committed, but for the crime of refusing to be their instrument. As life ebbed from his broken body, as his blood seeped into the cold cobblestones of that forgotten alley, Astarion's thoughts turned to all the things he would never experience, the reverie that would never come, the memories of past lives he would never unlock, the wisdom of centuries he would never gain. The young elf who had believed so fervently in justice discovered its absence in the most brutal way possible. Death came slowly, consciousness fading in waves, as his body surrendered to its injuries. In those final moments, Astarion might have thought about the cases left unfinished, the people who would appear before an empty bench seeking justice that would now be delayed or denied. He might have wondered if anyone would remember him as more than a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging the powerful. But in that cold alley, as his blood painted abstract patterns on ancient stones, death was not the end, but a transformation more terrible than anything he could have imagined. For watching from the deeper shadows, patient as only the truly ancient can be patient, stood Cazador Sar. The vampire lord had been drawn by the scent of violence and the promise of fresh prey. But something about the dying elf caught his interest beyond mere hunger. Perhaps it was the irony that appealed to Cazador's twisted sense of humor. A magistrate who had spent his life dispensing justice now receiving the ultimate injustice at the hands of those he had served. Perhaps it was simply the convenience of finding a victim whose disappearance might not be immediately investigated. Or perhaps, in some dark recess of his ancient mind, Cazador recognized something in the broken young elf that he could use, could corrupt, could transform into an instrument of his own terrible will. The offer, when it came, seemed like salvation itself. Life instead of death, immortality instead of ending, power instead of the helplessness that had left him bleeding in an alley. Cazador's voice cut through the haze of approaching death like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. All Astarion had to do was accept, to choose existence over oblivion, to trust in the kindness of this mysterious stranger who offered what no one else could give. In his dying delirium, Astarion could not see the predatory smile that accompanied the offer, could not understand the true price of the gift being offered. He knew only that he did not want to die, that he had too much left undone, too many years ahead of him that he would never see. When death seemed inevitable, and this stranger offered an alternative, what rational person would refuse? The transformation that followed would haunt him for centuries. But in that moment, it felt like the answer to every prayer he had never thought to pray. As Cazador's teeth pierced his throat, as his mortal blood flowed into the vampire's ancient hunger, Astarion felt his old life ending and something new beginning. The magistrate who had believed in justice died in that alley, replaced by something that would learn to survive in a world where justice was nothing more than a cruel joke told by those with power over those without it. The awakening that followed was unlike anything that had ever been described in the ancient texts of elven lore or the learned treatises on death and resurrection that lined the shelves of Baldur's Gate's greatest libraries. When consciousness returned to what had once been Astarion Ancunin, it came not with the gentle transition from sleep to wakefulness that had marked every morning of his mortal life, but with a violent, desperate clawing through 6 feet of cold earth that had been shoveled over his transformed body. His fingers, now possessed of unnatural strength, tore through dirt and roots and the remnants of whatever crude burial his attackers had provided. Each handful of soil he clawed away revealed the horrifying reality of his situation. He had been buried alive, or rather, buried in whatever state existed between life and death. The panic that drove him upward through the suffocating darkness was primal, desperate, the kind of terror that exists beyond rational thought. When he finally broke through to the surface, gasping for air his lungs no longer truly needed, retching up dirt and congealed blood, the world that greeted him seemed fundamentally changed. Colors appeared more vivid, yet somehow drained of warmth. Sounds carried with crystalline clarity that made even whispers seem to echo in his enhanced hearing. And sense, oh, the sense that now assaulted his heightened senses, painted the world in ways he had never imagined possible. But standing there in the moonlight, patient as death itself, was Cazador Sar. The vampire lord watched his newest spawn emerge from the earth with the detached interest of someone observing a mildly amusing experiment. There was no warmth in his pale features, no compassion for the confusion and terror written across Astarion's dirt-stained face, only the cold satisfaction of ownership, the pleasure of someone who had acquired a new possession. The words Cazador spoke in that moment would echo in Astarion's mind for the next 2 centuries, each syllable carved into memory with the precision of a master stoneworker. Welcome to your new existence, child. You belong to me now, and you will learn that freedom is a luxury you can no longer afford. The casual cruelty in that voice, the matter-of-fact delivery of what amounted to a sentence of eternal slavery, marked the true beginning of Astarion's nightmare. The vampire spawn that Astarion had become was something altogether different from the undead creatures of folklore and fearful whispers. He retained his intelligence, his memories, his essential self, but all of it was now filtered through an existence that defied every natural law he had once understood. His body no longer aged, no longer required food or sleep in any conventional sense, but it demanded something far more terrible: blood, preferably drawn from the living, preferably taken while the heart still beat with terror. The hunger was constant, gnawing, impossible to ignore for more than brief moments. It colored every interaction, tainted every thought, made even the simplest conversations feel like elaborate dances around the truth of what he had become. The magistrate who had once deliberated carefully over evidence and precedent now found his attention constantly drawn to the pulse points of everyone around him, to the rhythmic throbbing of life that called to him with siren intensity. Cazador's palace became both home and prison, a sprawling monument to centuries of accumulated wealth, built on a foundation of suffering and death. The architecture spoke of different eras, rooms and wings added as fashions changed, and the vampire lord's tastes evolved. But every stone was steeped in the same atmosphere of dread and barely controlled violence. It was a place where screams echoed in empty corridors and shadows held more substance than the light. The other spawn who inhabited this nightmare were Astarion's siblings in suffering, though Cazador's influence ensured that any bonds between them were twisted by competition and mutual distrust. Each spawn represented a different era of the vampire lord's existence, plucked from their original lives and reshaped into instruments of his will. They had once been individuals with hopes, dreams, and identities of their own, but centuries under Cazador's control had worn away much of what made them unique. There was Petrus, whose original life had been forgotten so completely that even he could barely remember what he had been before the transformation. His survival strategy involved complete submission to Cazador's will, an eager compliance that earned him slightly better treatment at the cost of whatever remained of his soul. Watching Petrus, Astarion could see one possible future for himself: the complete surrender of individual identity in exchange for the illusion of safety. Deliria had been a physician once, though the healing hands that had once saved lives now served only to prolong suffering when Cazador required information from his victims. Her medical knowledge made her particularly valuable for certain kinds of interrogation, and the bitter irony of her situation was not lost on anyone who witnessed her work. She had learned to compartmentalize her actions, to separate the person she had been from the monster she was forced to become. Violet carried herself with a predatory grace that suggested she had adapted to her new existence more completely than the others, but her eyes held depths of rage that spoke to the violence of her initial resistance and subsequent breaking. She had fought Cazador's control longer than most, and the punishments she had endured for that defiance served as object lessons for any other spawn who might consider rebellion. Leon and Yuzen completed this dysfunctional family, each carrying their own stories of loss and adaptation, each finding their own ways to survive in circumstances that offered no good choices. Together, they formed a household bound not by affection or shared purpose, but by mutual suffering and the iron control of their master. The rules of this existence were simple and absolute. Cazador's word was law. His desires were commands that brooked no hesitation or interpretation. The spawn existed to serve his needs, to advance his goals, to provide entertainment when he grew bored with the usual pleasures of immortal life. Their own wants, needs, and preferences were irrelevant, except when they aligned with his purposes. Disobedience was met with punishment that could last for days, weeks, or in extreme cases, years. Cazador had perfected cruelty, the way other immortals might perfect art or music, turning the infliction of suffering into something approaching genius. He understood exactly how much pain each spawn could endure before breaking completely, and he calibrated his punishments to approach, but never cross that final line. The physical tortures were terrible enough. Sessions in the palace's deeper chambers where screams meant nothing, and mercy was a concept that had no place. But the psychological torments were perhaps worse. The careful destruction of hope and self-worth that left the spawn questioning whether they deserved anything better than the hell they inhabited. Cazador took particular pleasure in reminding them of what they had lost through their transformation. He would describe in loving detail the lives they might have lived, the people they might have become, the achievements that would now forever remain beyond their reach. For Astarion, these sessions often focused on the reverie he would never experience, the elven maturity he would never achieve, the connection to his ancestral memories that had been severed by his undead state. The work they were required to perform was perhaps the cruelest aspect of their existence. Each spawn served as bait, using whatever natural charm or beauty they possessed to lure victims back to the palace. They would frequent taverns and social gatherings, identify suitable targets, and engage in elaborate seductions that ended invariably in death or worse for their victims. Astarion's particular talent lay in his ability to project vulnerability while maintaining an aura of sophistication that appealed to those who enjoyed feeling protective of someone they perceived as delicate. His elven features, preserved in their youthful state by the vampire curse, made him appear younger and more innocent than his actual years warranted. Combined with his education and natural eloquence, he could present himself as the perfect conquest for those who wanted to feel both powerful and cultured. The process of selection was itself a form of psychological torture. Astarion had to evaluate potential victims not just for their suitability to Cazador's needs, but for their likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. This calculation forced him to become intimately familiar with loneliness and desperation, to identify those whose absence would create the smallest ripples in the world's fabric. Night after night, he would venture into Baldur's Gate's social scene, attending gatherings where wine flowed freely and inhibitions lowered with each passing hour. He learned to read people with the skill of someone whose survival depended on accurate assessment. The merchant's daughter, seeking adventure beyond her sheltered life. The young noble looking for excitement away from watchful family eyes. The lonely widow who had been isolated by grief and social propriety. Each successful hunt required him to become someone different, to craft a personality that would appeal to that specific target's needs and desires. For the sheltered daughter, he might play the worldly gentleman, offering glimpses of a broader existence. For the adventure-seeking noble, he could become the mysterious stranger with hints of dangerous secrets. For the lonely widow, he transformed into the understanding companion who appreciated her sophistication and offered gentle comfort. The actual seduction was a performance that required complete commitment to the role he had chosen. Every gesture, every word, every expression had to be carefully calibrated to draw the target deeper into his web. He became expert at reading the subtle signs that indicated when someone was ready to abandon their usual caution, when they had been sufficiently charmed to follow him into situations they would normally avoid. The most successful hunts were those where the target believed they were the one doing the seducing. Astarion learned to project just enough resistance to make his eventual surrender seem like a victory for his victim. He would appear reluctant to leave familiar surroundings, hesitant to trust too quickly, carefully vulnerable in ways that made his targets feel both protective and predatory. The walk back to the palace was often the longest part of each hunt, filled with conversation designed to keep the victim comfortable while leading them steadily toward their doom. Astarion became skilled at urban geography, not for its own sake, but because he needed to know which routes would minimize the chances of unwanted encounters or witnesses who might remember seeing him with someone who would soon disappear. The handoff to Cazador was swift and efficient, a practiced routine that had been perfected through countless repetitions. The victim would be taken to chambers deep within the palace, and Astarion would retreat to his own quarters, trying not to think about what was happening elsewhere in the building. The screams that sometimes echoed through the corridors made such willful ignorance difficult to maintain. The psychological toll of this existence was cumulative, building night after night as the years stretched into decades and then centuries. Each successful hunt added another weight to the burden of guilt that Astarion carried, another face to haunt whatever dreams his vampiric state allowed. The knowledge that he was directly responsible for the suffering and death of countless innocents ate away at whatever remained of the idealistic magistrate he had once been. Sleep, when it came to him, offered no relief from the horror of his existence. The vampire's rest was not the peaceful oblivion that mortals enjoyed, but a twilight state where memories and regrets mingled with an awareness of the world around him. He could hear the activities of the palace continuing while he lay motionless, could sense the approach of threats or opportunities, but could not act upon this knowledge until true wakefulness returned. The few attempts at rebellion that occurred over the centuries were crushed with such overwhelming force that they served primarily as object lessons for the other spawn. Cazador's response to defiance was swift and terrible, involving punishments that lasted far longer than seemed possible and left the offending spawn broken in ways that went beyond mere physical damage. Astarion witnessed one such punishment early in his captivity, when Violet attempted to refuse an assignment that particularly revolted her. The consequences were so severe and so prolonged that they fundamentally changed how all the spawn understood the boundaries of their existence. Cazador did not merely punish the body, he attacked the mind, the spirit, the very sense of self that made existence bearable. The isolation was perhaps the worst aspect of these punishments. The offending spawn would be locked away in chambers deep beneath even the palace's regular dungeons, places where no sound could penetrate and no light could reach. Time became meaningless in such places, stretching into an eternity of sensory deprivation that left its victims questioning their own sanity. When the punishment finally ended and the spawn was released, they returned to the general population fundamentally changed. The spark of rebellion that had driven their defiance was gone, replaced by a hollow compliance that spoke to the complete success of Cazador's methods. They served thereafter with mechanical efficiency, no longer truly present in their own actions. The feeding arrangements were another source of constant humiliation and degradation. The spawn were provided with blood, but never enough to satisfy their hunger completely, and never of a quality that approached what they truly craved. Cazador would feed them diseased rats, putrid offerings that satisfied their supernatural hunger, while emphasizing their complete dependence on his generosity. The contrast between the rich, warm blood of living humans that they procured for their master and the revolting sustenance they were allowed was a daily reminder of their position in the hierarchy. They could smell the life and vitality in the blood they helped harvest, could feel their own hunger intensify at its proximity, but they were forbidden to partake, except at Cazador's explicit permission. Occasionally, as a reward for particularly successful work, or simply as a whim, Cazador would allow one of the spawn to feed properly. These moments were both blessing and curse, providing temporary relief from the constant hunger while making the return to their usual degraded diet all the more unbearable. The spawn who received such favor often found themselves resented by their siblings, creating additional divisions within an already fractured household. The decades accumulated like sediment, each year adding another layer to the prison of habit and learned helplessness that defined the spawn's existence. What had initially seemed like an existence that might somehow be escaped or endured began to feel like a permanent state, a condition that would continue unchanged until the end of time itself. Astarion's memories of his mortal life began to fade, not through any supernatural effect, but through the simple passage of time and the constant need to focus on survival. The face of his original self became harder to recall, the dreams and ambitions of the young magistrate seeming increasingly irrelevant to his current circumstances. He began to lose touch with the person he had been, until that earlier existence felt more like a story he had heard than a life he had actually lived. The social skills that had made him effective as a magistrate were twisted and corrupted into tools for manipulation and deception. His ability to read people's motivations became a weapon for identifying their weaknesses. His eloquence and charm were turned into instruments for leading innocents to their destruction. Every positive quality he had once possessed was perverted into something that served Cazador's dark purposes. The centuries taught him lessons that no mortal should ever have to learn. He discovered exactly how much psychological pressure a person could endure before breaking completely. He learned to identify the precise moment when hope died in someone's eyes, and how to hasten or delay that moment according to his master's preferences. He became an expert in the geography of human weakness, able to map the pathways to despair with cartographer's precision. By the time 200 years had passed, the spawn who answered to the name Astarion bore only superficial resemblance to the elf who had once dispensed justice from a magistrate's bench. The physical form remained unchanged, preserved in undead perfection, but the mind and spirit within had been shaped by centuries of horror into something entirely different. He had learned to survive in circumstances that would have destroyed lesser beings, but the cost of that survival was the systematic destruction of everything he had once valued about himself. The masks he wore became so numerous and so complete that he sometimes lost track of which one represented his true self. The charming seducer, the obedient servant, the broken victim, the cunning survivor, all of these personas served their purposes, but none of them captured the full complexity of what he had become. He existed in a state of constant performance, never quite sure which role was most authentic or most useful in any given situation. And through it all, Cazador watched with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully broken something beautiful and remade it into something useful. The vampire lord took particular pleasure in Astarion's transformation, seeing in it validation of his own power and a testament to his skill at psychological manipulation. He had taken an idealistic young magistrate and created the perfect predator, one who could lure victims with genuine charm while feeling just enough guilt to add seasoning to his suffering. The night when everything would finally change was still years away, but it was approaching with the inevitability of dawn after the longest night. Soon, mind flayers would descend from their ship in the sky, and with them would come the first taste of freedom that Astarion had experienced in over 2 centuries. But until that moment arrived, he continued his existence in the shadows of Cazador's palace, counting each night as both a small victory of survival and another step deeper into the darkness that had consumed his soul. The abduction came without warning, as such horrors always do. One moment Astarion was walking through the familiar shadows of Baldur's Gate on another hunt for his master, and the next he found himself suspended in a writhing cocoon of alien flesh aboard a vessel that defied every law of physics and sanity he had ever known. The nautiloid ship that had plucked him from the streets was a thing of living nightmare, its walls pulsing with organic rhythms that suggested something between architecture and anatomy. The mind flayers who had taken him moved through their ship with the fluid grace of creatures perfectly adapted to their environment. Their elongated heads, crowned with writhing tentacles that seemed to possess independent life, marked them as beings from realms far removed from the material plane. These illithids, as the learned called them, represented a horror beyond even Cazador's worst cruelties. The complete consumption of individual identity, the transformation of thinking beings into extensions of their collective will. The ceramorphosis chambers where they brought him were designed with the clinical precision of beings who had perfected this process across countless worlds and countless victims. Pod after pod contained individuals in various stages of transformation, their faces slack with the peaceful expression of those whose minds had already been consumed. The tadpoles that would complete this terrible metamorphosis writhed in pools of cerebrospinal fluid, eager to find new hosts for their alien consciousness. When they forced the tadpole behind his eye, the pain was immediate and overwhelming. But beneath the agony lay something else, something that took precious seconds for Astarion to recognize. The loosening of bonds that had held him captive for over 2 centuries. The mind flayer parasite, in its eagerness to remake his brain according to its own patterns, was severing the supernatural connections that tied him to Cazador's will. The sensation was indescribable to someone who had never experienced true mental freedom. For 200 years, every thought, every decision, every moment of his existence had been filtered through the awareness of his master's presence. Cazador's control had been so complete, so pervasive, that Astarion had forgotten what it felt like to have thoughts that were truly his own. The tadpole's interference with his neural pathways was creating gaps in that control, moments of genuine autonomy that he had not tasted since his mortal life. But there was no time to savor this unexpected liberation. The nautiloid was under attack, its organic corridors filling with the sounds of battle as Githyanki warriors boarded the vessel. These dragon riders had come to reclaim something the mind flayers had stolen, and their arrival turned the ship into a battlefield where the screams of dying illithids mingled with the crash of weapons and the roar of flames. The other prisoners who had been selected for ceramorphosis were awakening from their cocoons, each discovering their own version of the tadpole's gift and curse. There was Shadowheart, a half-elf cleric whose devotion to her goddess seemed at odds with the mysterious shadows that clung to her presence. Her healing magic carried undertones of darkness that suggested affiliations with powers that most clerics would find abhorrent, yet her desire to help the other survivors seemed genuine. Gale presented himself as a wizard of considerable learning, though his easy manner and scholarly appearance concealed depths of magical knowledge that bordered on the dangerous. He spoke of Waterdeep and the great libraries there, but there was something in his eyes that suggested intimate familiarity with forces that lesser mages feared to contemplate. His offer to share his expertise came with undertones that hinted at personal stakes in their survival. Lae'zel was Githyanki herself, a warrior from the very race that was even now tearing apart the nautiloid with methodical efficiency. Her presence among the prisoners raised questions about loyalties and purposes that would not be easily answered. She spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Yet her situation suggested that her own people might not welcome her return with open arms. The ship's destruction was both catastrophic and liberating. The nautiloid, mortally wounded by the Githyanki assault and whatever other forces had converged upon it, began its death spiral toward the material plane. The crash that followed was violent beyond description, a collision that should have killed everyone aboard yet somehow left the infected survivors alive and relatively intact. Awakening on the beach felt like being reborn into a world that had become fundamentally different overnight. The sun, which Astarion had not felt on his skin for over 2 centuries, now warmed his undead flesh without causing the burning agony that should have reduced him to ash within moments. The mind flayer tadpole had altered more than just his mental state. It had somehow granted him immunity to the traditional weaknesses of his vampiric nature. The implications of this change were staggering. He could walk in daylight, could cross running water, could enter homes without invitation. All the restrictions that had defined his existence as a vampire spawn had been temporarily lifted by the alien parasite swimming in his brain. Yet this gift came with a terrible countdown, for the tadpole would eventually complete its work and transform him into something far worse than any vampire. The wreckage of the nautiloid lay scattered across the landscape like the bones of some impossible beast. Debris that had once been living ships stretched for hundreds of yards, creating a maze of organic ruins that told the story of the craft's violent end. Among these remains lay evidence of the battle that had raged aboard: Githyanki weapons, illithid technology, and the remains of creatures from a dozen different worlds. The first encounters with his fellow survivors established patterns that would define their relationships for whatever time they had left. Each person was grappling with their own version of the crisis, their own fears about the transformation that awaited them, their own desperate hope that some solution might exist. The tadpole created an unwilling fellowship, binding them together, not through shared ideals, but through shared doom. Astarion's initial meeting with the others was charged with suspicion and barely controlled violence. 2 centuries of existence as a predator had taught him to evaluate every person he met as either threat or prey, and these unexpected companions represented unknowns that could prove dangerous. His first instinct was to establish dominance, to make clear that he was not someone to be trifled with. The knife he held to the throat of his would-be leader spoke to reflexes honed by centuries of survival in Cazador's court. Trust was a luxury he had not been able to afford for longer than most mortals lived, and the habits of paranoia were not easily abandoned. Yet something in the way his target handled the confrontation, the combination of calm competence and genuine concern for his welfare, suggested that these might be people worth allying with rather than eliminating. The realization that he could refuse orders, could make his own decisions about whether to join this improvised group, was intoxicating in ways that someone who had never lost their freedom could not fully appreciate. For the first time in 200 years, he could say no to a request without facing immediate and overwhelming punishment. He could evaluate options based on his own interests rather than his master's commands. The decision to travel with these strangers was pragmatic rather than altruistic. Alone, his chances of finding a cure for the tadpole infestation were minimal. The resources and knowledge that each companion brought to their shared problem increased the odds of survival for all of them. But beneath this cold calculation lay something else: the simple human need for companionship, for connection with others who understood his predicament. The landscape they traveled through bore the scars of recent conflict and older disasters. This region near Baldur's Gate had seen more than its share of wars and catastrophes, and the evidence lay scattered across the countryside in the form of abandoned settlements, ancient battlefields, and ruins that spoke to the impermanence of all mortal achievements. It was a reminder that even without Mind Flayer tadpoles, survival was never guaranteed in a world where powerful forces competed for dominance. The nights brought their own revelations and complications. His companions began to notice peculiarities in his behavior: the way he avoided certain foods, his preference for traveling after dark, the predatory grace that marked his movements even in casual conversation. The vampire's nature was not something that could be hidden indefinitely from observant traveling companions, especially when one of them possessed divine magic that could detect undead creatures. The blood hunger remained constant despite the tadpole's other effects. If anything, the parasite seemed to intensify his need for sustenance, as though the alien presence was drawing additional resources from his already strained system. The familiar, gnawing emptiness that had defined his existence under Cazador continued to torment him, made worse by the knowledge that he was now free to hunt, but constrained by the need to maintain his companion's trust. The solution to this dilemma came through a combination of desperation and opportunity. Wild animals provided sustenance that was both accessible and morally acceptable, even if the taste left much to be desired compared to human blood. Deer, rabbits, and other woodland creatures became his primary source of nourishment, their life force sufficient to keep him functional if not fully satisfied. But the deeper hunger, the craving that went beyond mere physical sustenance, remained unaddressed. The blood of thinking creatures carried something that animal blood could not provide: the essence of consciousness itself, the spark of self-awareness that vampires truly craved. This absence left him feeling perpetually hollow, as though he was slowly starving despite regular feeding. The camp they established each evening became a stage for subtle performances and careful observations. Each member of their makeshift fellowship was keeping secrets, harboring agendas that they were not yet ready to share with the others. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tensions and barely concealed suspicions, yet necessity forced them to maintain at least the appearance of cooperation. Shadowheart's devotion to her mysterious goddess created one set of complications, particularly when her healing magic was most needed. The divine power she channeled carried undertones of darkness that made Astarion's vampiric nature resonate in uncomfortable ways. There was recognition there, an acknowledgement of shared allegiance to forces that existed outside conventional morality. Gale's magical knowledge offered hope for understanding and potentially curing their condition, but his obvious familiarity with dangerous arcane forces raised questions about his past and his motivations. The wizard's easy charm concealed depths of power that could prove either salvation or destruction depending on how events unfolded. Lae'zel's warrior culture provided practical knowledge about mind flayers and their methods, but her casual acceptance of violence as a solution to most problems created its own tensions within the group. Her people's long war against the Illithids had given them extensive experience with seramorphosis, though that knowledge came with a fatalistic acceptance of the transformation's inevitability. The dreams that came during their rest periods were unlike anything Astarion had experienced in his undead existence. The tadpole seemed to create connections between the infected minds, allowing glimpses into his companion's thoughts and memories that revealed far more than any of them intended to share. These psychic intrusions were disturbing not just for their invasion of privacy, but for the unwanted intimacy they created between relative strangers. Through these dream connections, he began to understand that each of his companions carried burdens comparable to his own. Shadowheart's memories were clouded by what seemed to be deliberate obscuration, suggesting that her past had been taken from her through magical means. Gale's guilt over some catastrophic mistake involving powerful magic weighed on him like a physical burden. Lae'zel's certainty about her people's ways masked deeper questions about her own worthiness and place in their rigid hierarchy. The knowledge that others were suffering, that he was not alone in carrying the weight of a traumatic past, created an unexpected foundation for genuine connection. For someone who had spent 2 centuries in isolation, punctuated only by predatory interactions, the possibility of real companionship was both terrifying and intoxicating. Yet trust remained elusive. The habits of secrecy and deception that had kept him alive under Cazador's rule did not disappear overnight. Every conversation was still calculated. Every revelation weighed against potential risks. Every moment of apparent vulnerability carefully managed to project strength rather than weakness. The masks he had worn for so long could not be simply discarded, even when their continued use might sabotage the very connections he craved. The supernatural bond created by their shared infection added another layer of complexity to their relationships. They could sense each other's presence in ways that normal companions could not, could sometimes catch glimpses of each other's emotional states through the psychic static generated by the tadpoles. This unwanted intimacy forced a kind of connection that none of them had chosen, but all of them had to navigate. The urgency of their situation created a strange paradox. On one hand, they were racing against time to find a cure before the transformation completed and destroyed their individual identities forever. On the other hand, the freedom that Astarion was experiencing for the first time in centuries made him want to savor every moment of autonomous existence, even if that existence was temporary. The simple act of making choices based on his own preferences rather than his master's commands remained intoxicating. When the group debated which direction to travel, he could voice his own opinion and have it carry the same weight as anyone else's. When they encountered moral dilemmas, he could choose his response based on his own values rather than Cazador's twisted expectations. This newfound agency extended to his interactions with potential victims as well. The people they encountered on their journey represented opportunities for feeding that he was free to pursue or ignore according to his own judgment. The temptation was constant and overwhelming, but the choice was genuinely his to make. The restraint he chose to exercise was motivated partly by pragmatism and partly by something deeper. His companion's trust was valuable enough to be worth preserving, even at the cost of continued hunger. But beneath this calculation lay the stirring of something he had thought Cazador had destroyed completely: the capacity for genuine moral consideration. The magistrate who had once believed in justice had not been entirely erased by 2 centuries of enforced evil. Deep beneath the layers of trauma and learned survival behaviors, some fragment of his original moral sense remained intact. The tadpole's interference with Cazador's control had not only freed his actions, but had also allowed this buried conscience to begin reasserting itself. The internal conflict this created was intense and constant. Every situation they encountered forced him to choose between the predatory instincts that had kept him alive and the moral impulses that were slowly reawakening. The decisions he made in these moments would determine not just his companion's opinion of him, but his own understanding of who he might become if he survived the tadpole's influence. The journey ahead promised to be long and dangerous, filled with challenges that would test not just their survival skills, but their ability to work together despite their individual secrets and agendas. For Astarion, it represented the first real chance he had been given in over 2 centuries to discover who he might choose to be when the choice was genuinely his to make. The sun continued to warm his pale skin as they traveled, a daily reminder of the strange gift the tadpole had granted him. Each dawn brought another day of freedom, another opportunity to make decisions that reflected his own will rather than his master's commands. Whether that freedom would last long enough for him to do something meaningful with it remained to be seen. But for now, it was enough simply to exist as himself for the first time in longer than most mortals could imagine. The art of surviving through performance had become so ingrained in Astarion's nature that he donned his seductive persona as naturally as drawing breath. The charming mask that had served him through 2 centuries of horror slipped into place with practiced ease, a carefully crafted facade designed to make others see exactly what they expected to see. A devastatingly attractive elf with rakish charm and just enough dangerous mystery to be irresistible. This performance was not born of vanity or genuine confidence, but of pure necessity. In Cazador's court, those who could not make themselves useful in some capacity quickly found themselves subjected to the kind of attention that left lasting scars on both body and soul. Astarion had learned early in his captivity that his elven features, preserved in their youthful perfection by the vampire curse, could serve as both weapon and shield when properly deployed. The seductive mask he wore, was a masterwork of psychological manipulation, layered with subtle details that had been refined through decades of practical application. Every gesture was calculated to suggest both availability and challenge, every word chosen to hint at depths of passion that could be unlocked by the right person. He had studied his targets with the dedication of a scholar, learning exactly which emotional buttons to press to make them feel special, desired, uniquely capable of reaching the real person behind his mysterious exterior. But now, traveling with companions who were beginning to matter to him in ways that went beyond mere utility, the mask felt increasingly burdensome. The constant performance required energy he could ill afford to waste, attention that needed to be focused on their shared survival, emotional resources that were already stretched thin by the trauma of his past and the uncertainty of his future. Yet he could not simply abandon the protective facade that had kept him alive for so long. To do so would require a level of vulnerability that his survival instincts screamed against, a nakedness of spirit that left him exposed to exactly the kind of exploitation he had endured for centuries. The performance continued because the alternative, genuine honesty about his fears, needs, and limitations, seemed far more dangerous than maintaining the exhausting charade. His companions were beginning to see through the carefully constructed illusion, though each responded to their growing awareness in different ways. Shadowheart, with her own secrets to protect, seemed to understand the necessity of maintaining certain boundaries while still acknowledging the deeper truths that lay beneath surface presentations. Her occasional knowing glances suggested recognition of a kindred spirit struggling with the balance between protection and connection. Gale's scholarly mind was clearly intrigued by the puzzle Astarion presented, the obvious disconnection between his performed confidence and the underlying currents of genuine fear and pain. The wizard's attempts to engage him in philosophical discussions about identity and authenticity felt like gentle probes designed to encourage voluntary revelation rather than forced exposure. Lae'zel's warrior culture had little patience for deception and performance, yet even she seemed to recognize that his masks served a purpose beyond mere vanity. Her occasional sharp observations cut through his pretenses with surgical precision, but she showed no inclination to weaponize the vulnerabilities she uncovered. Perhaps her own struggles with living up to impossible standards created a foundation for unexpected empathy. The blood revelation came as both relief and terror, the moment when his carefully maintained secret could no longer be contained within the boundaries of performance and misdirection. The hunger that gnawed constantly at his consciousness had grown too intense to ignore, too consuming to satisfy with the meager sustenance provided by forest animals. His body was demanding proper nourishment, and the scent of warm blood flowing through his companion's veins had become a constant torment. The approach he chose reflected decades of experience in reading people's psychological profiles and emotional needs, rather than attempting the kind of subtle manipulation that had served him in Cazador's hunts. He opted for a more direct strategy, one that acknowledged his nature, while positioning himself as both dangerous enough to be respected and vulnerable enough to inspire sympathy rather than fear. The actual attempt at feeding was clumsy by his usual standards, driven more by desperate hunger than careful planning. The discovery by his intended victim should have marked the end of his place in their fellowship, the moment when his usefulness was outweighed by the threat he represented. Instead, it became something unprecedented in his experience, an opportunity for genuine negotiation between equals. The conversation that followed revealed depths of understanding and compassion that Astarion had forgotten existed in the world. Rather than responding with immediate violence or rejection, his would-be victim engaged with him as a person struggling with circumstances beyond his control. The offer to allow him to feed, made freely and with full knowledge of what it entailed, represented a kind of trust that he had not experienced since his mortal life. The act of feeding consensually was transformative in ways that went far beyond the physical satisfaction of his hunger. For 2 centuries, every drop of blood he had tasted had been taken through deception, coercion, or outright violence. The knowledge that someone was choosing to help him, to make themselves vulnerable for his benefit, without expectation of reciprocal exploitation, created emotional resonances that he struggled to process. The gratitude that followed was as genuine as anything he had felt since his transformation. The small happiness buff that his magical nature granted in response to proper nourishment felt like a glimpse of something he had thought lost forever. The possibility of joy that was not tainted by guilt or fear. For a brief moment, he could remember what it felt like to be pleased with his existence rather than merely enduring it. But the feeding also awakened hungers that went beyond the physical. The taste of willing blood, freely given, reminded him of pleasures and satisfactions that had been systematically denied to him for centuries. The contrast between this gift and the diseased rats that Cazador had forced him to subsist on was stark enough to bring tears to eyes that had forgotten how to weep from anything other than pain. The flirtation that followed the feeding was part performance and part genuine emotional response, a confused mixture of practiced manipulation and authentic gratitude that reflected his inability to separate survival behaviors from genuine feeling. He had spent so long using charm and seduction as tools for staying alive that he no longer knew how to express appreciation or affection without defaulting to those familiar patterns. The admission that his companion was his first proper feeding in 2 centuries carried multiple layers of meaning that he was only beginning to understand himself. On the surface, it was a simple statement of fact. He had indeed never fed on a thinking being without Cazador's direct involvement and control. But beneath that lay the deeper truth that this was his first truly voluntary interaction with someone else's blood, his first experience of feeding that was not tainted by coercion or disgust. The sweetness in his voice, when he called his benefactor a generous thing, was not entirely calculated, though the predatory undertones remained reflexive rather than intentional. 2 centuries of using his charm to lure victims to their doom had created patterns of speech and behavior that operated below conscious control, automatic responses that engaged whenever he felt vulnerable or grateful. The developing dynamic around repeated feeding sessions revealed the complex psychology of someone learning to navigate consent and reciprocity after centuries of existing only within frameworks of domination and submission. Each invitation to drink carried its own weight of significance, each acceptance a small act of trust that built towards something resembling genuine intimacy. The mirror scene became a moment of profound revelation about identity, loss, and the nature of self-knowledge. Standing before a reflective surface that showed only the empty space where he should be, Astarion confronted the full magnitude of what he had lost through his transformation. The inability to see his own reflection was more than just a vampiric limitation. It was a metaphor for the complete disconnection from his sense of self that 2 centuries of abuse had created. The conversation about his appearance, his inability to remember the color of his eyes before they turned red, opened wounds that had been carefully sealed beneath layers of performance and denial. The old Astarion, the magistrate who had believed in justice and possessed clear moral convictions, existed now only in fragments of memory that grew dimmer with each passing year. The face he wore was the only one he could remember, but it belonged to someone else. The victim Cazador had created rather than the person he had once been. The offer to serve as his mirror, to describe what others saw when they looked at him, represented an intimacy more profound than any physical contact they might share. To allow someone else to define his appearance was to acknowledge a level of dependency that his survival instincts found terrifying, yet the hunger to understand how he was perceived by the world proved stronger than his fear of vulnerability. The descriptions he received painted a picture of someone more complex than the simple predator he had been taught to see himself as. The recognition of intelligence in his features, the acknowledgement of pain alongside beauty, the detailed inventory of characteristics that marked him as unique rather than merely dangerous. All of this contributed to a slowly rebuilding sense of individual identity. But the mirror scene also revealed the depth of his vanity, the way he had learned to use his appearance as both weapon and shield in a world that consistently reduced him to his most basic functions. The attention he paid to his looks was not mere narcissism but a survival strategy, a way of maintaining some sense of control over how others perceived and treated him. The comment about his smile lines cut deeper than he was willing to admit, touching on the fundamental question of whether his expressions of happiness were genuine or merely practiced responses, designed to manipulate others. 2 centuries of wearing masks had left him uncertain about which emotions were real and which were performance, which smiles came from joy and which from the desperate need to please those who held power over him. The seductive behavior that had become his default mode of interaction with others was beginning to feel increasingly hollow as genuine connections developed with his traveling companions. The flirtation that had once served as armor now seemed like a barrier, preventing the kind of authentic communication that his healing required. Yet, abandoning these familiar patterns meant entering emotional territory that he had not navigated since his mortal life. The dreams began to change. As the tadpole's influence deepened and his relationships with his companions evolved beyond mere alliance born of necessity, the psychic connections created by their shared infection allowed glimpses into each other's memories and emotions that revealed the extent to which they were all struggling with questions of identity, purpose, and the possibility of redemption after traumatic experiences. Through these dream glimpses, he began to understand that his companions saw him differently than he saw himself. Where he perceived only the predator that Cazador had shaped, they recognized traces of the person he had been and hints of the person he might become. Their continued acceptance, despite growing awareness of his nature, provided a foundation for the kind of self-acceptance that had seemed impossible during his centuries of captivity. The gradual dropping of his masks was not a conscious decision, but an organic process driven by exhaustion and genuine care. The energy required to maintain constant performance was enormous, and the safety he felt with his companions made the expenditure seem less necessary. Small moments of genuine reaction began to slip through the cracks in his facade. Laughter that was not calculated for effect, anger that was not designed to intimidate, vulnerability that was not intended to inspire protective instincts. These authentic moments were terrifying in their unfamiliarity, yet they also brought relief that he had not experienced in centuries. To express genuine emotion without immediately calculating its effect on others. To speak truth without first considering how it might be used against him. To exist without constant awareness of the persona he was projecting. These simple freedoms felt revolutionary. After so many years of careful control, the recognition that his companions valued these authentic moments more than his polished performances was both validating and confusing. He had spent so long believing that his worth lay in his ability to be what others wanted, that the idea of being appreciated for his genuine self seemed almost incomprehensible. Yet the evidence was undeniable in their responses to his unguarded moments. The flirtation that continued between feeding sessions began to evolve beyond mere transactional performance art. The appreciation he expressed was increasingly genuine, motivated not by the need to maintain access to blood, but by actual gratitude and growing affection. The charm he deployed was less calculated and more reflective of actual pleasure in their company. But the habits of performance remained strong, creating moments of confusion where he was not entirely sure whether his responses were authentic or automatic. The line between genuine seduction and survival strategy had been blurred for so long that reconstructing it required conscious effort and careful self-examination that he was only beginning to learn how to practice. The developing intimacy with his companions created both opportunity and danger. The growing trust between them made genuine vulnerability possible, but it also meant that any betrayal or revelation of his true nature could destroy relationships that had become precious to him. The balance between honesty and self-protection required constant negotiation, a delicate dance between revelation and concealment. The knowledge that others were beginning to care about him created responsibilities that he had not carried for centuries. Their trust made their safety his concern, their well-being a factor in his decision-making process that went beyond mere alliance of convenience. The magistrate's sense of justice, buried but not destroyed by his years of enforced evil, began to reassert itself in small ways that surprised him with their strength. The person he was becoming through these interactions felt both familiar and strange, like putting on clothes that had once fit perfectly, but now hung differently on a body, changed by experience. The core of his identity remained consistent, but the expression of that identity was evolving as new possibilities for behavior and relationship opened before him. The masks were not disappearing, but becoming more selective, deployed consciously rather than automatically. He was learning to distinguish between situations that required protection and those that allowed for genuine connection, between people who could be trusted with authenticity and those who would exploit any vulnerability they discovered. This growing sophistication in his emotional responses represented the first real healing he had experienced since his transformation. The ability to choose his level of openness based on genuine assessment rather than blanket fear marked a return of agency that extended beyond the physical freedom granted by the tadpole's interference with Cazador's control. The journey ahead would test these tentative steps toward authenticity, challenging him to maintain his developing sense of self while navigating dangers that might require the very masks he was learning to set aside. But for the first time in centuries, he possessed genuine hope that the person emerging from behind those protective facades might be worth the risk of vulnerability. The first intimations that Cazador's reach extended far beyond the physical boundaries of his palace came in whispers and shadows, in the behavior of strangers who seemed to know more about Astarion than any casual observer should possess. The vampire spawn who had once been invisible to the world at large, noticed only when he chose to be seen, now found himself the subject of scrutiny from sources he could not identify or escape. The realization that his former master was actively hunting him transformed every interaction from a potential connection into a possible threat. Merchants who lingered too long while examining his features, travelers who asked seemingly innocent questions about his origins, even fellow refugees from various disasters who showed unusual interest in his story. All became suspects in an elaborate web of surveillance that might lead directly back to the palace of horrors he had escaped. The paranoia this created was both rational and consuming. 2 centuries of conditioning had taught him that Cazador's patience was infinite, his resources vast, and his memory perfect. The vampire lord would not simply accept the loss of his most effective spawn, would not allow such a precedent to stand unchallenged. Every moment of freedom that Astarion enjoyed was borrowed time, a temporary reprieve that could end without warning when his master's agents finally located their quarry. The scars that decorated his back became the key to understanding the full scope of his predicament. These marks, carved into his flesh during sessions of torture that had stretched across decades, had always been presented as artistic expressions of Cazador's aesthetic preferences. The vampire lord had claimed they formed a poem written in infernal script, a beautiful arrangement of symbols that transformed Astarion's body into a canvas for his master's creativity. The truth, when it was finally revealed through Raphael's intervention, proved far more sinister than mere sadistic decoration. The scars were not poetry but contract terms, binding clauses written in the language of devils that tied Astarion's very essence to a ritual of unimaginable power. Each line carved into his flesh represented a legal obligation in infernal law, a commitment sealed in blood and pain that could not be broken through ordinary means. The rite of profane ascension that these scarified contract terms described was something that had never been successfully completed in the recorded history of vampiric lore. The ritual promised to elevate its practitioner beyond the limitations that defined even the most powerful undead creatures, granting the benefits of vampiric immortality while eliminating the weaknesses that traditionally balanced such gifts. The vampire who achieved this ascension would walk in sunlight without burning, command the loyalty of all lesser undead, and wield power that rivaled the gods themselves. But the price for such transcendence was measured in souls rather than gold or blood. The ritual required the sacrifice of 7,000 vampire spawn, each death-feeding power into the ascending vampire until the accumulated spiritual energy achieved critical mass. The spawn chosen for this sacrifice were not random victims, but beings specifically prepared through centuries of conditioning, their souls refined through suffering until they became perfect vessels for the dark transformation. Astarion's role in this cosmic horror was both central and disposable. As the final component needed to complete the ritual, his death would serve as the catalyst that transformed Cazador from powerful undead lord into something approaching divinity. The scars that covered his back were not just contract terms, but targeting symbols, mystical markers that would allow the ritual magic to locate and claim him regardless of distance or protection. The realization that he had been groomed for this purpose from the moment of his transformation recontextualized every aspect of his centuries-long captivity. The specific tortures he had endured, the particular humiliations that had been visited upon him, the careful cultivation of his despair and self-hatred. All of it had been designed to prepare his soul for consumption in the ritual. He was not merely Cazador's victim, but his masterpiece, a work of spiritual art created specifically for destruction. The other spawn who shared his captivity were revealed to be components in the same vast project, each prepared according to their individual psychological profiles to maximize their spiritual value when sacrificed. The brothers and sisters in suffering who had provided what little companionship was possible under Cazador's rule were all destined for the same fate, their deaths as carefully planned as their lives had been meticulously controlled. The 7,000 additional spawn that the ritual required represented an investment of resources and planning that spoke to the true scope of Cazador's ambition. These victims, hidden away in chambers deep beneath the palace, had been created specifically for sacrifice rather than service. Their existence was even more horrific than that of the spawn who lived in the palace proper, as they had been granted awareness of their fate from the moment of their transformation. Sebastian's presence among these condemned souls added a personal dimension to the horror that made it almost unbearable to contemplate. The sweet young man who had trusted Astarion enough to follow him into danger, who had represented everything innocent and hopeful about human nature, had spent decades locked in darkness with the certain knowledge that his suffering would culminate in ritual murder. The guilt that Astarion felt upon seeing Sebastian again was compounded by the recognition that his own actions had been just as carefully manipulated as everything else about his existence under Cazador's control. The victims he had selected, the methods he had used to lure them, even the emotional responses he had felt during the hunt, all of it had been shaped by his master's invisible influence to serve the greater purpose of the ritual. The psychological impact of understanding his complete powerlessness in the face of Cazador's long-term planning was devastating. Every choice he thought he had made, every small act of resistance he had managed, every moment of agency he believed he had preserved, all of it had been illusion, part of a script written by someone who understood his psychology better than he understood it himself. The discovery that his companions were also being hunted, that their association with him had made them targets in Cazador's larger scheme, added another layer of responsibility to his already overwhelming burden of guilt. The freedom he had found through their friendship was now endangering the very people who had made that freedom meaningful, creating a cruel paradox that threatened to destroy everything positive that had emerged from his escape. The vampire hunter who appeared to reclaim him carried messages and methods that spoke to Cazador's intimate knowledge of his psychological vulnerabilities. The choice of a noble as the agent of his recapture was no accident, but a deliberate echo of the circumstances that had led to his original death. The vampire lord wanted him to remember that night in the alley, to relive the helplessness and betrayal that had defined his transformation from idealistic magistrate to broken spawn. This psychological warfare extended beyond mere cruelty into strategic manipulation, designed to weaken his resolve and make him more compliant when the final confrontation came. Cazador understood that Astarion's newfound sense of agency and self-worth were his greatest weapons in resisting the ritual's completion. By systematically attacking those foundations, the vampire lord sought to reduce his escaped spawn to the broken creature who would accept death as a relief from suffering. The knowledge that he was being stalked by agents equipped with intimate knowledge of his fears, weaknesses, and emotional triggers created a state of hypervigilance that exhausted his mental resources and strained his relationships with his companions. Every stranger became a potential threat, every coincidence a possible trap, every moment of peace a dangerous opportunity for enemies to close the distance. The infernal contract that bound him to his fate was written in legal language that even his experience as a magistrate could not fully parse. The archdevil Mephistopheles, who had authored the original agreement, had crafted terms that were binding across multiple planes of existence, enforceable by powers that transcended mortal law and divine intervention. The ritual would proceed according to schedule, unless the contract itself could be destroyed or its terms fundamentally altered. Raphael's involvement in revealing the truth came with its own complications and moral ambiguities. The devil's willingness to provide information was motivated not by altruism but by his own schemes and rivalries within the infernal hierarchy. The knowledge he offered came at a price that would create new obligations and dangers, trading one form of bondage for another. The bargain that Raphael proposed seemed almost reasonable compared to the certainty of death that awaited if the ritual proceeded uninterrupted. The devil's terms were clearly stated. His reputation for honoring agreements was well established, and his power to protect against other supernatural threats was beyond question. Yet, accepting his offer would mean acknowledging that true freedom was impossible, that escape from one master only led to servitude under another. The temptation to accept Raphael's protection was intensified by the growing evidence that Cazador's resources and reach were far greater than anyone had initially understood. The vampire lord's network of agents, allies, and supernatural contacts spanned multiple planes of existence and included powers that could challenge even the most resourceful group of adventurers. The other companion's responses to learning about the infernal contract and the ritual it described revealed the depth of their commitment to his welfare and their understanding of the stakes involved. Their willingness to face supernatural enemies far beyond their normal capabilities, to venture into realms of existence that defied their understanding of reality, demonstrated a loyalty that transcended mere alliance born of shared necessity. Yet their support also created additional pressure to find a solution that would not require them to sacrifice their own goals and safety for his benefit. The knowledge that they were willing to do so made the prospect of accepting such sacrifice almost unthinkable, adding emotional complexity to decisions that were already fraught with moral and practical complications. The developing plan to confront Cazador directly and disrupt the ritual before it could be completed represented both their best hope for permanent resolution and their most dangerous gamble. The Vampire Lord's centuries of preparation, his supernatural powers, and his intimate knowledge of their capabilities made him a formidable opponent under any circumstances. Facing him in his own stronghold, surrounded by his resources and protections, seemed like a strategy born more of desperation than tactical wisdom. But the alternative, living forever as fugitives, while Cazador's agents slowly closed in, watching their companions suffer the consequences of association with him, knowing that the ritual's completion was merely delayed rather than prevented, seemed even less acceptable than the risks of direct confrontation. The weight of all those other souls bound to the same fate added urgency that transcended personal considerations. Sebastian and the thousands of other spawn trapped in Cazador's dungeons had no agency in their situation, no ability to escape or fight back against the doom that awaited them. Their only hope lay in the actions of those who had managed to break free from the Vampire Lord's direct control. The responsibility of being perhaps the only person in a position to prevent this massive atrocity was crushing in its magnitude. The magistrate, who had once believed in justice, found himself facing the ultimate test of those beliefs, forced to choose between personal survival and the welfare of thousands of innocent victims. The scars on his back, once symbols of his powerlessness and humiliation, began to take on new meaning as evidence of Cazador's limitations and fears. The need to mark his victims, to bind them through external symbols rather than pure force of will, suggested that the Vampire Lord's power, while vast, was not unlimited. The careful preparation required for the ritual indicated that its success was not guaranteed, that disruption was possible for those willing to risk everything in the attempt. The growing understanding that he was not merely a victim but a crucial component in a cosmic horror story gave him a strange form of power, even in his apparent helplessness. Cazador needed him alive and relatively intact for the ritual to succeed, which created opportunities for resistance that had not existed during his captivity. The path forward remained unclear, fraught with dangers that could destroy not just himself but everyone who had chosen to stand with him against the darkness. Yet for the first time since his transformation, he possessed both the knowledge necessary to understand his true situation and the support required to have some hope of changing it. The final confrontation with his maker was inevitable, but its outcome would be determined by choices that were genuinely his own rather than moves in someone else's grand design. The recognition of trauma as a living force that shaped every aspect of his existence came not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual awakening to truths that had been hidden beneath layers of survival mechanisms and desperate adaptation. For 2 centuries, Astarion had understood his suffering only in terms of immediate survival, which behaviors would minimize punishment, which masks would provide protection, which strategies would allow him to endure another night in Cazador's service. The broader psychological damage inflicted by this existence had been something to be ignored, suppressed, or worked around rather than confronted and healed. The framework for understanding his condition came through conversations with companions who possessed their own intimate knowledge of trauma's effects. Shadowheart's struggle with stolen memories, Gale's guilt over catastrophic magical mistakes, Lae'zel's disillusionment with everything she had been taught to value, each provided mirrors that reflected different aspects of how past wounds continued to influence present choices. Through witnessing their healing journeys, he began to recognize patterns in his own behavior that went far beyond simple survival instincts. The hypervigilance that made him catalog every exit from every room, assess every stranger as a potential threat, and maintain constant awareness of his companion's emotional states was not merely prudent caution, but a trauma response that exhausted his mental resources and prevented him from experiencing genuine relaxation. The compulsive performance of charm and seduction was not just manipulative behavior, but a learned survival strategy that had become so automatic he no longer knew how to interact authentically with others. The nightmares that plagued his rest, when the tadpole's influence allowed him to experience something approaching normal sleep, were not random anxieties, but specific re-experiencing of traumatic events that his mind was struggling to process and integrate. The way his body tensed at unexpected touch, the way his voice changed when he felt cornered or threatened, the way he defaulted to submissive compliance when confronted with authority figures. All of these responses spoke to wounds that went far deeper than conscious memory. Understanding the nature of these wounds was only the first step in a healing process that would require dismantling defenses that had kept him alive for centuries. The irony was not lost on him that the very mechanisms that had enabled his survival under Cazador's rule now stood as barriers to the kind of authentic relationships that might provide genuine safety and support in his new circumstances. The concept of bodily autonomy had been so thoroughly eradicated from his existence that rediscovering it felt like learning to use limbs that had been paralyzed for decades. The simple idea that he could say no to requests, that he had the right to establish boundaries around his physical person, that his consent was required for any intimate contact. These were revolutionary concepts that challenged everything he had been conditioned to accept about his place in the world. The moment when this realization crystallized came during an encounter with the drow alchemist who sought to use him as she would any vampire spawn, as a tool for her purposes, with his own preferences, treated as irrelevant obstacles to be overridden through command or manipulation. The expectation that he would simply comply, that his companions would simply order him to provide what she wanted, that his own feelings about the matter were immaterial to the transaction. All of this was so familiar as to be almost comfortable in its horrific predictability. But his companion's response to this situation provided a template for something he had never experienced: respect for his autonomy, even when that respect came at a cost to others. The choice to honor his refusal rather than pressure him to comply, to accept the loss of potential benefits rather than violate his right to self-determination, demonstrated a form of care that went beyond mere kindness to encompass genuine respect for his personhood. The gratitude he felt for this protection was so overwhelming that it initially manifested as confusion and disbelief. The idea that someone would sacrifice their own interests to preserve his autonomy was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process it emotionally. Yet beneath the confusion lay something that felt like the first stirring of genuine self-worth he had experienced since his mortal life. The recognition that he was valued as more than just a useful object. The conversation that followed this incident became a watershed moment in his understanding of consent, agency, and the nature of healthy relationships. The acknowledgement that he had been used as an object for so long that he had internalized this treatment as normal was painful but necessary for beginning the process of reclaiming his sense of self. The recognition that his body belonged to him, that he had the right to determine how it was used, that others were obligated to respect his boundaries. These were truths that needed to be stated explicitly and repeatedly before they could begin to feel real. The revelation about his intimate relationships with his companions carried particular weight because it forced him to confront the ways that trauma had corrupted even his attempts at genuine connection. The admission that his early seductions had been purely transactional, motivated by survival rather than desire or affection, required acknowledging that he had been incapable of authentic intimacy, even when he desperately wanted to achieve it. The explanation of his behavior came with visible shame that spoke to his growing ability to distinguish between actions taken from necessity and those that aligned with his true values. The recognition that he had manipulated people who cared about him, that he had used their attraction and affection as tools for his own security, created guilt that was both appropriate and potentially destructive if left unexamined. But the response of his companions to these revelations provided another model for healthy relationship dynamics, the ability to separate his actions from his character, to understand that survival behaviors developed under extreme duress did not define his fundamental nature or his capacity for genuine connection. Their continued support, despite learning about his deceptive motivations, demonstrated forgiveness and understanding that helped him begin to forgive himself. The request to pause physical intimacy was perhaps the most difficult boundary he had ever attempted to establish, requiring him to risk losing something precious for the sake of principles he was still learning to value. The fear that his companions would abandon him if he was no longer available for their sexual gratification was rooted in centuries of conditioning that equated his worth with his utility as an object of pleasure. The gentle acceptance of this request, the lack of argument or pressure or emotional manipulation in response, provided concrete evidence that his value to others extended beyond his sexual availability. The willingness to maintain their relationship on different terms rather than demanding continued access to his body represented a form of respect that validated his growing sense of self-worth. The vulnerability required to express his uncertainty about whether he wanted anyone to see him in sexual terms was extraordinary, given his history of being reduced to precisely that function. The admission that he no longer knew his own desires, that centuries of performing sexuality for others' benefit had left him disconnected from his own preferences and boundaries, revealed the depth of the psychological damage he was working to repair. The exploration of what healthy intimacy might look like without sexual components opened entirely new territories of human connection that he had never been allowed to explore. The possibility of being valued for his thoughts, his personality, his company, his contributions to their shared endeavors rather than his physical attractiveness or sexual availability was transformative in its implications. The conversations that followed his request for space revealed capacities for emotional intimacy that had been buried beneath layers of trauma and survival behaviors. The ability to share fears and hopes without immediate calculation of how such vulnerability might be exploited, to express genuine affection without expecting reciprocal performance, to exist in someone else's presence without maintaining constant vigilance. These were skills that required conscious practice to redevelop. The recognition that his relationships were evolving beyond transactional exchanges into something approaching genuine friendship was both thrilling and terrifying. The investment of emotional energy in others' welfare, the development of preferences about their happiness and success that went beyond mere alliance maintenance, the growing sense that their presence in his life had value independent of their utility. All of this represented emotional growth that made him more vulnerable but also more authentically human. The understanding that friendship might be what he needed more than romance was a revelation that recontextualized his entire approach to interpersonal relationships. The possibility of being known, accepted, and valued without the complications of sexual attraction or romantic obligation offered a foundation for connection that felt both safer and more meaningful than the passionate but unstable dynamics he had previously pursued. The joy he expressed at the concept of friendship spoke to deprivations that went far beyond sexual or romantic fulfillment. The idea of someone who would support him without expectation of physical reciprocation, who would value his company for its own sake, who would choose to spend time with him based on genuine affinity rather than attraction. These were forms of human connection that he had been denied even before his transformation into a vampire spawn. The healing that came from being seen and accepted in his entirety, including his damage and his limitations, provided a foundation for self-acceptance that had been impossible while he was hiding behind protective masks. The ability to exist authentically in others' presence, to share his struggles and fears without losing their support, to be valued despite his imperfections, rather than because of his performed perfection. These experiences began to repair wounds that had seemed permanent and irreversible. The gradual reconstruction of his emotional vocabulary allowed him to begin distinguishing between different types of care, affection, and support that he received from others. The recognition that not all positive attention was sexually motivated, that not all kindness came with strings attached, that not all expressions of concern were manipulative attempts to gain something from him. These distinctions were crucial for developing the trust necessary for continued healing. The work of rebuilding his capacity for genuine emotional expression required conscious effort and constant vigilance against automatic responses developed through centuries of performance. The impulse to charm his way out of difficult conversations, to deflect serious topics with humor or seduction, to present himself as whatever others wanted to see, rather than who he actually was. These patterns had become so deeply ingrained that overriding them required constant conscious choice. The support network that developed among his companions provided multiple models for healthy relationship dynamics and emotional processing techniques. Each person brought different strengths to their collective healing journey. Shadowheart's understanding of religious trauma and identity reconstruction, Gale's experience with guilt and the fear of causing harm to others, Lae'zel's process of questioning fundamental beliefs and rebuilding personal values from first principles. The reciprocal nature of this support network allowed him to experience the satisfaction of helping others while receiving help himself, creating a balance that felt sustainable rather than extractive. The ability to contribute to others' healing journeys while working on his own provided a sense of purpose and value that went beyond mere survival, reconnecting him with the service-oriented instincts that had motivated his original career as a magistrate. The understanding that healing was not a destination but an ongoing process helped him develop patience with his own progress and setbacks. The recognition that trauma responses might always be part of his psychological landscape, but that they could be managed and their influence minimized through continued work and supportive relationships, provided a framework for long-term recovery that felt achievable rather than impossibly distant. The growing ability to envision a future that included genuine happiness, meaningful relationships, and purposeful activity began to replace the simple goal of survival that had defined his existence for so long. The possibility that he might not just endure his existence but actually enjoy it, that he might contribute positively to the world rather than merely taking from it, that he might become someone worthy of the care and respect others had shown him. These hopes provided motivation for continued healing work, even when the process felt overwhelmingly difficult. The choice to reject cycles of abuse and power in favor of healing and connection represented perhaps the most fundamental transformation of his entire existence. The decision to break patterns that had defined his relationships for centuries, to risk vulnerability for the sake of authenticity, to choose growth over safety. These choices required courage that drew from sources deeper than mere survival instinct, tapping into values and aspirations that connected him to the person he had been before his transformation and the person he might yet become. The return to Cazador's palace was like descending into the physical manifestation of nightmare itself, where every stone had absorbed centuries of screams, and every shadow held memories of unspeakable torments. The building that had once been Astarion's prison now awaited him as the site of either his ultimate liberation or his final destruction, its familiar corridors and chambers taking on new meaning, as he approached them not as a captive spawn, but as someone choosing to confront the architect of his suffering. The very air within those walls seemed thick with malevolence and despair, carrying scents that triggered involuntary responses from his traumatized psyche. The metallic tang of old blood, the acrid smell of fear sweat, the underlying decay that spoke to bodies left too long in darkness, all of it combined to create an atmosphere that made every breath feel like an act of violence against his own well-being. Yet he pressed forward, sustained by the presence of companions who had chosen to stand with him against this ultimate test. The palace's architecture reflected Cazador's twisted psychology, made manifest in stone and mortar. Corridors that seemed to lead somewhere meaningful would dead-end in chambers designed for torture, while hidden passages connected spaces in ways that allowed constant surveillance and unexpected appearances. The layout was designed to disorient and intimidate, to make inhabitants feel lost even in familiar surroundings, to emphasize their complete dependence on their master's knowledge and guidance for basic navigation. The Spawn siblings who still inhabited this house of horrors moved through its spaces with the mechanical precision of beings whose spirits had been so thoroughly broken that only muscle memory and conditioned response remained. Petrus, Deliria, Violet, Leon, Eusen, all of them bore the marks of decades or centuries spent in service to Cazador's appetites, their individual personalities worn away by endless repetition of degrading tasks and constant fear of punishment. Seeing them again after tasting freedom was almost unbearably painful, like encountering beloved friends who had been lobotomized while he was away. The recognition in their eyes was fleeting and quickly suppressed, replaced by the empty compliance that had become their default state. They knew him, but could not acknowledge that knowledge, without risking the kind of punishment that had taught them to prefer emotional death over continued resistance. The deeper chambers of the palace revealed the true scope of Cazador's ambitions and the horrific efficiency with which he had pursued them. Room after room contained spawn who had been created solely for the purpose of ritual sacrifice, beings who had never known even the limited freedom that the palace-dwelling spawn had occasionally experienced. These victims existed in conditions that made Astarion's own captivity seem almost merciful by comparison. The 7,000 spawn who awaited sacrifice had been kept in cells that barely allowed movement, fed just enough to maintain their undead existence while being systematically broken through isolation and sensory deprivation. Their faces, when glimpsed in the dim light that barely penetrated their underground prison, showed the hollow-eyed emptiness of beings who had been reduced to their most basic functions. They were alive in the technical sense, but had been stripped of everything that made existence meaningful or bearable. Sebastian's presence among these condemned souls transformed abstract horror into personal anguish that threatened to overwhelm Astarion's carefully maintained composure. The young man who had once represented everything innocent and trusting about humanity had spent decades in conditions designed to destroy hope itself. The recognition that passed between them was immediate and devastating, carrying the weight of all the guilt and regret that Astarion had carried since that night in the tavern so many years ago. The conversation with Sebastian revealed the full magnitude of what Cazador's victims had endured and the extent to which Astarion's own actions had contributed to their suffering. The sweetness that had made Sebastian such an appealing target had been systematically tortured out of him, replaced by the kind of desperate hunger for release that made death seem like a blessing rather than a tragedy. Yet beneath the damage, traces of the person he had once been remained visible, making his condition all the more heartbreaking. The knowledge that he was personally responsible for Sebastian's fate, that his choice of victim had condemned this particular innocent to decades of unimaginable suffering, created a weight of guilt that threatened to crush his resolve. The logical understanding that refusing to hunt would have resulted in his own destruction, that someone else would have selected different victims for the same horrible fate, provided little comfort against the visceral reality of facing someone whose life he had personally destroyed. The psychological impact of this confrontation manifested in ways that his companions could observe and measure. The curse of the Syed that left him disadvantaged in all saving throws while surrounded by traumatic memories. His body's stress response to being in this place was so severe that it interfered with his basic cognitive and physical functions, making him less capable precisely when he most needed his full abilities. Yet this vulnerability also represented a form of emotional honesty that his protective masks had long concealed. The visible distress he experienced in Cazador's presence was genuine trauma response rather than calculated performance, authentic feeling that connected him to the reality of his own suffering rather than the dissociated numbness that had allowed him to survive his captivity. The approach to Cazador's ritual chamber required navigating not just physical obstacles, but psychological barriers that had been reinforced through centuries of conditioning. Every step deeper into the palace triggered memories of punishments received, lessons learned through pain, moments when resistance had been crushed so thoroughly that the memory of them still paralyzed his will to fight back. The ritual chamber itself was a masterwork of supernatural engineering, designed to channel and focus the kind of mystical energies required for the rite of profane ascension. The intricate symbols carved into every surface, the positioning of the sacrifice points, the elaborate mechanisms that would transform individual deaths into collective power, all of it spoke to planning and preparation that had consumed centuries of Cazador's existence. At the center of this elaborate magical construct stood Cazador himself, unchanged by the years that had passed since Astarion's escape, but somehow diminished by the proximity of his ultimate triumph. The vampire lord, who had seemed godlike in his power and knowledge, now appeared more clearly as what he truly was. A creature driven by fears and insecurities so profound that they could only be addressed through the acquisition of absolute power over others. The confrontation that followed was both intensely personal and cosmically significant, a battle between victim and abuser that would determine not just their individual fates, but the destiny of thousands of other souls caught in Cazador's web of suffering. The verbal exchange that preceded physical violence carried the weight of 2 centuries of accumulated grievance and the desperate need for some form of accounting for the horror that had been inflicted. Cazador's attempts to reduce Astarion to his former state of terrified compliance followed patterns that had been refined through centuries of psychological manipulation. Every insult was calculated to trigger specific insecurities, every gesture designed to evoke memories of powerlessness, every word chosen to remind him of his supposed inferiority and dependence. The vampire lord sought to recreate the mental state that had made his spawn compliant through the simple expedient of verbal abuse and intimidation. But the person who stood before Cazador was no longer the broken creature who had once cowered in his presence. 2 centuries of survival had built strength that even systematic abuse could not entirely destroy, and recent experiences of genuine care and respect had begun to rebuild the sense of self-worth that torture had sought to eliminate. The support of his companions provided both practical assistance and emotional foundation for resistance that transcended mere survival instinct. The moment when Cazador's supernatural control seized him and dragged him to his position in the ritual array was perhaps the most terrifying of his entire existence, combining the helplessness of his original captivity with the knowledge of exactly what fate awaited him. The familiar sensation of his will being overridden by his master's commands triggered every trauma response he had developed, yet also sparked a rage that had been building for over 2 centuries. The battle that erupted around the ritual chamber was chaotic and desperate, with his companions fighting not just for victory, but for the opportunity to save him before the ritual could reach completion. The urgency of their efforts, the risks they took on his behalf, the way they prioritized his rescue over their own safety, all of this provided concrete evidence of the bonds that had developed between them, relationships based on genuine care rather than mere utility. The rescue itself came through a combination of tactical skill, magical power, and sheer determination that spoke to the effectiveness of their partnership and the depth of their commitment to his welfare. Being freed from Cazador's control through others' intervention rather than his own strength was both humbling and liberating, demonstrating that accepting help was not weakness, but wisdom. The opportunity to participate in Cazador's defeat provided the kind of closure that centuries of suffering demanded. Each blow struck against his tormentor carried the weight of every humiliation endured, every moment of powerlessness experienced, every life destroyed through his enforced complicity. The physical act of violence became a form of communication that transcended words, a statement about agency and justice that could only be made through action. Yet the moment when Cazador retreated to his coffin for what he assumed would be temporary safety also presented the ultimate test of who Astarion would choose to become. The ritual array remained functional, the accumulated power still available to be claimed, the possibility of ascending to vampiric godhood within his grasp if he could bring himself to complete what his master had started. The temptation to seize this power was overwhelming in its intensity, offering everything he had ever dreamed of during his centuries of captivity. The ability to walk in sunlight permanently, to command the loyalty of all lesser undead, to never again fear anyone or anything. These gifts seemed to justify almost any price, even the sacrifice of thousands of innocent souls. The magistrate who had once believed in justice found himself facing the ultimate corruption of those ideals, the transformation of righteous anger into the kind of evil he had once sworn to oppose. The intervention of his companions at this crucial moment provided both practical obstacle and moral mirror, forcing him to see his choice reflected in their eyes and understand what accepting the ritual's power would cost him in terms of the relationships that had made his freedom meaningful, their willingness to stand against him if necessary, to risk their own lives to prevent him from becoming the very evil they had fought to destroy, demonstrated a form of love that valued his soul over his approval. The decision to reject ascension and instead destroy the ritual entirely was perhaps the most important choice of his entire existence, representing a fundamental commitment to growth over power, connection over dominance, healing over revenge. The destruction of Cazador through conventional violence rather than mystical transcendence was both more personally satisfying and more morally defensible, allowing justice without requiring the perpetuation of the cycle of abuse that had defined his existence. The moment when Cazador's long reign of terror finally ended was marked not by triumph or celebration, but by a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and the beginning of a grief process that had been delayed for centuries. The Vampire Lord's death removed an immediate threat, but also eliminated the focus that had given meaning to decades of suffering, leaving a void that would need to be filled with new purposes and relationships. The cathartic release of stabbing his tormentor repeatedly was both necessary and troubling, a moment of pure revenge that satisfied deep psychological needs while also demonstrating how close to the edge of becoming a monster himself he had come. The violence was justified but also revelatory, showing capacities for cruelty that would need to be acknowledged and controlled if he were to avoid becoming the very thing he had destroyed. The tears that finally came with Cazador's death were the first genuine tears he had shed since his transformation, representing not just relief, but the beginning of a mourning process for everything he had lost during his centuries of captivity. The freedom to grieve openly, to express pain without fear of exploitation or punishment, to be vulnerable in the presence of others who would protect rather than prey upon that vulnerability. These were gifts that his tormentor's death had finally made possible. The emotional numbness that followed this climactic moment was a natural response to trauma resolution, the psychological equivalent of shock that protected him from being overwhelmed by the full magnitude of what had been accomplished and what it meant for his future. The feeling that victory was somehow hollow despite its obvious significance reflected the reality that external triumph could not immediately heal internal wounds that had been decades in the making. The long process of recovery and integration that lay ahead would require different kinds of courage than the physical bravery needed to face Cazador in battle. Learning to live without the defining structure that his captivity had provided, building an identity based on choice rather than compulsion, creating meaning from freedom rather than survival. These challenges would test his character in ways that no supernatural enemy ever could. The victory that should have felt like the culmination of centuries of struggle arrived wrapped in an unexpected emptiness that left Astarion staring at Cazador's corpse with a sense of profound disconnection from his own emotions. The Vampire Lord's death had been everything he had dreamed of during his darkest moments, violent, final, and richly deserved. Yet the satisfaction he had expected to feel was replaced by a numbness that seemed to hollow out his chest and leave him feeling strangely bereft. The tears that had come so freely during the act of killing his tormentor dried up almost immediately afterward, leaving him with dry eyes and a sensation of emotional flatness that was more disturbing than the overwhelming grief he had anticipated. The justice he had sought for so long had been achieved. The threat that had defined his existence for over 2 centuries had been eliminated, yet the world felt no different than it had before Cazador drew his last breath. This absence of triumphant joy was perhaps the most honest response possible to the complex reality of trauma resolution. The fantasy of revenge that had sustained him through decades of suffering had always included the implicit promise that destroying his abuser would somehow restore what had been taken from him, would return him to the person he had been before his transformation. The reality that emerged from Cazador's death was far more complicated. The past could not be undone, the years of suffering could not be erased, and the person he had been before his captivity was gone forever. The emotional numbness that settled over him in the immediate aftermath was his psyche's way of protecting him from being overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. After spending so much energy focused on the goal of confronting Cazador, the sudden absence of that driving purpose left him adrift in ways he had not anticipated. The structure that his captivity had imposed on his existence, the clear hierarchy, the defined role, the predictable patterns of abuse and compliance, had been terrible but familiar, and its complete absence created a void that he was not yet equipped to fill. His companions' attempts to celebrate their victory met with responses that confused even him. The congratulations and expressions of relief that they offered seemed to bounce off him without making any emotional impact, leaving him feeling isolated even in the midst of their support. The disconnect between their obvious joy at his liberation and his own internal emptiness created a sense of alienation that was almost as painful as the trauma they had worked so hard to address. The practical questions that followed the battle's end: what to do with the thousands of spawn who had been intended for sacrifice, how to handle the palace's resources, what steps to take to ensure that Cazador's network of influence could not simply regenerate under new leadership, felt overwhelming in their complexity. For someone who had spent centuries having every decision made for him, the sudden responsibility for choices that would affect thousands of lives was paralyzing in its scope. The spawn who had been rescued from the ritual chambers presented particularly difficult moral dilemmas. Many of them had been transformed so long ago that they had no memory of their mortal lives or any existence outside captivity. Their conditioning was so complete that freedom was not liberation but terror, the removal of familiar structure, leaving them unable to function independently. The choice to release them into a world they were not equipped to navigate felt like a different kind of cruelty, yet keeping them confined seemed like a perpetuation of their suffering. Sebastian's condition encapsulated the complexity of these decisions in the most personal possible terms. The young man who had once represented innocence and hope had been so thoroughly broken by his decades of imprisonment that simple conversation was beyond his capabilities. The recognition that passed between them was real but painful. Acknowledging shared history while making clear that the person Sebastian had once been was as lost as the magistrate Astarion had once been. The guilt that arose from seeing what his choices had cost others was compounded by the knowledge that similar scenes were playing out with thousands of other victims whose stories he would never know. Each face in the ritual chambers represented someone who had trusted the wrong person, made a single mistake, or simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The randomness of their selection made their suffering feel both more tragic and more senseless. The conversations with his spawn siblings revealed the extent to which their shared captivity had created bonds that transcended normal family relationships, while simultaneously preventing the kind of authentic connection that might have provided mutual support. They had survived by learning not to care too deeply about each other's welfare, knowing that such attachments could be weaponized by their master. The attempt to reconnect with them now felt like trying to rebuild relationships that had been systematically poisoned by centuries of mutual surveillance and enforced betrayal. The palace itself, once the site of his greatest suffering, now stood as a monument to questions about justice, responsibility, and the proper response to systematic evil. The wealth that Cazador had accumulated through centuries of predation could potentially fund reconstruction efforts and provide support for his victims, but it could also serve as a magnet for those who would seek to inherit his power and influence. The decision about what to do with this legacy felt too momentous for someone who was still struggling to understand his own needs and desires. The return to his companion's camp after the palace's affairs were settled brought a different kind of challenge. The need to exist in normal social situations without the driving purpose that had sustained him through recent adventures. The casual conversations, shared meals, and mundane planning sessions that had once provided respite from larger concerns now felt almost unbearably ordinary, highlighting the absence of the intensity that had given recent events their meaning. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams that were different from the nightmares that had plagued him during his captivity, but no less disturbing in their own way. Instead of reliving moments of terror and helplessness, he found himself dreaming of empty spaces and echoing silences, vast halls where he wandered alone, calling for people who no longer existed. These dreams reflected the reality that destroying his abuser had not restored his losses, but had simply made their permanence impossible to ignore. The realization that Cazador continued to occupy his thoughts even after death was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this new phase of his existence. The vampire lord's voice still echoed in his mind during moments of self-doubt. His expectations still shaped Astarion's automatic responses to authority figures. His lessons about power and vulnerability still influenced decision-making processes. Death had ended Cazador's ability to inflict new harm, but had not erased the psychological patterns that centuries of abuse had established. The work of dismantling these internalized voices and replacing them with healthier thought patterns required conscious effort that was exhausting in its constancy. Every automatic response had to be examined and questioned, every emotional reaction analyzed to determine whether it reflected genuine feeling or programmed response. The process of learning to trust his own perceptions and judgments after having them systematically undermined for so long was like learning to walk again after decades of paralysis. His companion's patience with this process provided crucial support that made continued progress possible. Their willingness to repeat reassurances, to tolerate mood swings and emotional inconsistencies, to maintain steady presence even when he withdrew into protective isolation, demonstrated the kind of unconditional positive regard that his healing required. Yet their support also created obligations that felt overwhelming when his emotional resources were already stretched thin. The question of what to do with his freedom once it was truly secured became the central challenge of his new existence. The goals that had motivated him during his captivity, escape, revenge, survival, were no longer relevant to his circumstances, leaving him without clear direction for the first time in centuries. The possibility of simply existing for his own pleasure and fulfillment seemed both incredibly appealing and somehow insufficient after surviving experiences that had been so intensely meaningful despite their horror. The suggestion that they visit his grave, made during one of their evening conversations, initially struck him as morbid and unnecessary. The person buried there had died so long ago that mourning seemed pointless, and the idea of confronting physical reminders of his mortality felt like emotional masochism rather than healing ritual. Yet something about the proposal resonated with needs he could not fully articulate, desires for closure and acknowledgement that went beyond rational analysis. The journey to the cemetery where his mortal body had been interred took on the character of a pilgrimage, a deliberate return to the site where his current existence had begun. The grave marker, weathered by decades of neglect but still legible, bore the name and dates of someone who seemed like a stranger, despite sharing his memories and appearance. The dates carved in stone told the story of a life cut short, potential unrealized, dreams interrupted by violence. Standing before his own grave with someone who genuinely cared about his welfare created a moment of profound emotional complexity. The ritual of mourning his former self in the presence of someone who valued his current self provided a framework for integrating the different aspects of his identity rather than treating them as completely separate entities. The magistrate who had died in that alley was not entirely gone. Traces of his values, his intelligence, his capacity for justice remained embedded in the person who had survived Cazador's tortures. The conversation that took place in the cemetery allowed him to articulate feelings about loss, identity, and transformation that had been building for months without finding proper expression. The acknowledgement that he was fundamentally different from the person who had been buried there, yet still connected to that person's hopes and dreams, provided a way of understanding himself that embraced complexity rather than demanding simple answers. The decision to carve a new date into the headstone was both practical and symbolic. marking the moment when his true rebirth had occurred, rather than the night of his transformation into a vampire spawn. The date of Cazador's death represented the beginning of authentic existence, the moment when he had gained the ability to make genuine choices about his future, rather than simply surviving circumstances imposed by others. The physical act of altering the stone was more difficult than expected, requiring multiple attempts and considerable effort that left his hands scraped and dirty. Yet the labor itself felt meaningful, a way of claiming ownership over his own story rather than accepting the narrative that others had written for him. Each scratch of the blade against stone was a declaration of agency, an assertion of his right to define himself rather than being defined by his experiences. The emotional release that came with completing this symbolic rebirth was different from the tears that had accompanied Cazador's death. Softer, cleaner, more connected to hope than to pain. The crying that followed felt like a form of baptism, washing away residual traces of his captivity and preparing him for whatever came next. The person who emerged from this ritual was neither the naive magistrate who had died in an alley, nor the broken spawn who had served Cazador's will, but someone new who contained elements of both while being bound by the limitations of neither. The conversation about future plans that followed this emotional catharsis was tentative but genuinely hopeful, focusing on possibilities rather than merely survival strategies. The discussion of where they might travel, what adventures they might pursue, how they might use their skills and resources to help others, reflected a fundamental shift from reactive existence to proactive life choices. The future was no longer something to be endured, but something to be created through conscious decision and deliberate action. The intimacy that developed during this cemetery conversation was qualitatively different from anything they had shared before, based on genuine vulnerability rather than performed emotion or calculated revelation. The ability to share fears and hopes without immediate concern for how such honesty might be exploited represented a level of trust that his healing had made possible, but which still felt miraculous in its rarity. The night that followed their cemetery visit was the first in which he experienced something approaching genuine peace. Not the exhausted collapse that had marked the end of crisis periods, but the relaxed satisfaction of someone who had found a sustainable way of existing in the world. The sleep that came was unmarked by nightmares or anxiety dreams, allowing him to rest in ways that had been impossible during his decades of captivity and the intense period of crisis resolution that had followed his escape. The morning brought with it a sense of genuine possibility that had been absent from his existence since his mortal life. The future stretched ahead, not as a series of threats to be survived or obligations to be fulfilled, but as an open space where meaningful choices could be made based on authentic desires rather than survival necessities. The person who greeted the dawn was someone capable of growth, change, and the kind of deep connection with others that makes existence worthwhile rather than merely bearable. The choice to break the cycle of abuse rather than perpetuate it through his own ascension to power represented perhaps the most fundamental transformation of Astarion's entire existence, marking the moment when he truly became someone different from both the naive magistrate he had once been and the broken spawn that Cazador had created. This decision required rejecting not just the immediate temptation of supernatural power, but the entire framework of thinking that had sustained him through centuries of suffering. The belief that strength meant dominance over others, that safety required the ability to inflict harm, that justice was simply revenge with better justification, the understanding that power itself was not evil, but that his desire for it was rooted in fear and trauma took considerable time to develop and accept. The magistrate who had once wielded authority in service of justice had been replaced by someone who associated power with the capacity to avoid victimization, to ensure that others could never again reduce him to the status of object or tool. The appeal of vampiric ascension lay not in its potential for good, but in its promise that he would never again be vulnerable to the kind of systematic abuse he had endured. Recognizing this distinction allowed him to separate his legitimate needs for safety and autonomy from his trauma-driven desire to dominate others as protection against future harm. The work of healing required acknowledging that true security could not be achieved through accumulating power over others, but only through building genuine relationships based on mutual respect and support. The strength he had gained through surviving his ordeal was real and valuable, but it needed to be channeled into growth and connection rather than control and intimidation. The process of learning to trust others with his vulnerability while maintaining appropriate boundaries required constant conscious effort and frequent recalibration. Each relationship in his life demanded different levels of openness and different types of protection, and the skills needed to navigate these complexities had been systematically destroyed during his centuries of captivity. The ability to distinguish between people who deserved trust and those who might exploit his openness was something he had to rebuild from first principles. His companions provided crucial models for healthy relationship dynamics that allowed him to observe and practice new ways of interacting with others. Their ability to disagree without resorting to manipulation or violence, to support each other through difficulties without expecting total submission in return, to maintain individual identity while participating in group decisions. All of these behaviors represented alternatives to the power-based relationships that had defined his existence for so long. The development of genuine empathy for others' suffering, as opposed to the calculated understanding of weakness that had made him effective as Cazador's hunter, required confronting the ways that trauma had both sensitized him to pain and hardened him against caring about it. The protective numbness that had allowed him to function while participating in atrocities now stood as a barrier to the kind of emotional connection that authentic relationships required. The work of rebuilding his capacity for appropriate emotional response involved learning to feel others' pain without being overwhelmed by it, to care about their welfare without sacrificing his own needs, to offer support without enabling destructive behaviors. These distinctions were subtle and required practice to master, as his previous experience with interpersonal dynamics had been limited to the extremes of complete submission or calculated manipulation. The recognition that he could use his hard-won knowledge of trauma and survival to help others who had experienced similar abuse provided a way of transforming his suffering into something that served constructive purposes. The insights he had gained into the psychology of victimization, the strategies he had developed for emotional survival, the understanding he had acquired about the long process of healing, all of these could benefit others who were struggling with comparable challenges. Yet this desire to help had to be balanced against the recognition that his own healing was still incomplete, and that attempting to rescue others before securing his own stability could lead to relationships that recreated unhealthy patterns under the guise of altruism. The temptation to define himself through his usefulness to others was strong, echoing the conditioning that had taught him to equate his worth with his utility to those in positions of power. The ongoing work of developing an identity based on his own values and preferences rather than others' expectations required constant vigilance against the habits of performance and people-pleasing that had kept him alive for centuries. Learning to say no to requests that felt uncomfortable or overwhelming, to express preferences that might not align with others' desires, to take up space without justifying his right to exist. These were revolutionary acts for someone who had been systematically taught that his needs were irrelevant. The exploration of what brought him genuine joy and satisfaction, as opposed to mere survival or the approval of others, opened territories of experience that had been closed to him since his transformation. The simple pleasure of reading without ulterior motive, of appreciating beauty without calculating how to use it, of engaging in conversation for the sake of connection rather than information gathering. These activities felt almost transgressive in their lack of practical purpose. The developing relationship with his companions evolved beyond the crisis-driven bonds that had initially united them into something resembling the kind of chosen family that many trauma survivors create to replace biological relationships that have been damaged or lost. The loyalty and care that developed between them was tested not by dramatic emergencies but by the smaller challenges of daily existence, disagreements about priorities, conflicts over resources, the inevitable friction that occurs when people with different backgrounds and perspectives attempt to build shared lives. The ability to navigate these mundane conflicts without defaulting to manipulation, withdrawal, or explosive anger represented genuine progress in his emotional development. The skills needed for healthy disagreement, listening to understand rather than to find ammunition, expressing his own needs without attacking others, finding compromise solutions that respected everyone's legitimate interests, were entirely new to him and required conscious practice to develop. The question of what role romantic and sexual relationships might play in his future remained complex and evolving. The trauma he had experienced around intimacy could not be simply overcome through good intentions or the passage of time, and the process of learning to distinguish between genuine desire and conditioned response was likely to continue for years. The possibility that he might choose to remain celibate indefinitely was one he had to acknowledge and accept without treating it as failure or evidence of permanent damage. The conversations with his companions about consent, boundaries, and the nature of healthy intimacy provided education that his original upbringing had not included, and that his centuries of captivity had systematically corrupted. The understanding that physical intimacy should enhance rather than compromise emotional connection, that sexual activity should be chosen freely rather than performed out of obligation, that partners should be concerned with each other's pleasure and comfort rather than their own gratification. These concepts required both intellectual understanding and emotional integration to become genuine guides for behavior. The gradual reconstruction of his relationship with his own body involved learning to see it as something that belonged to him rather than something that existed for others' use. The vampire's enhanced physical capabilities, freed from Cazador's control, could be sources of strength and pleasure rather than tools for predation. The process of reclaiming ownership of his physicality required conscious attention to his own comfort and boundaries, learning to notice and respect his body's signals rather than overriding them in service of external demands. The work of developing meaningful goals and purposes for his existence beyond mere survival required imagining futures that had seemed impossible during his captivity. The possibility of contributing positively to the world, of using his skills and knowledge to help others, of building something lasting and meaningful. These ambitions felt both wonderful and terrifying in their scope. The fear of failure was compounded by the fear of success, as achieving his goals would require him to believe that he deserved good things and was capable of creating positive change. The ongoing process of integrating his various identities, the idealistic magistrate, the traumatized survivor, the person he was becoming through conscious choice, required accepting that he was all of these things simultaneously, rather than trying to eliminate aspects of himself that carried painful associations. The magistrate's sense of justice had been corrupted, but not destroyed by his experiences, and it could be reclaimed and redirected toward constructive purposes. The survival skills he had developed were morally neutral tools that could serve healing as well as harm. The relationship he was building with himself required the same patience, understanding, and commitment that healthy relationships with others demanded. The internal dialogue that had been dominated by Cazador's voice and his own self-criticism needed to be gradually replaced with more compassionate and realistic self-assessment. Learning to treat himself with the same kindness he would show a friend struggling with similar challenges was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his healing journey. The recognition that healing was not a destination but an ongoing process helped him develop patience with setbacks and realistic expectations about progress. The trauma responses that might always be part of his psychological landscape did not represent failure, but rather evidence of the human mind's remarkable ability to survive experiences that should have been fatal. The goal was not to eliminate all traces of his past suffering, but to ensure that it no longer controlled his present choices or future possibilities. The developing sense of hope for the future was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of his transformation, representing a fundamental shift from the survival-focused mindset that had sustained him through his darkest periods. The ability to imagine good things happening to him, to plan for experiences that brought joy rather than merely avoided pain, to believe that his best days might lie ahead rather than behind him. These changes in perspective created motivation for continued growth that went far beyond the simple desire to escape suffering. The commitment to using his freedom responsibly, to ensure that his liberation did not come at others' expense, reflected the rebirth of moral principles that had been buried but not destroyed by centuries of forced participation in evil. The magistrate's commitment to justice could be expressed through new channels, protecting other victims of abuse, working to prevent the kind of systematic exploitation he had endured, using his knowledge of darkness to help others find their way toward light. The understanding that true strength lay not in the ability to dominate others, but in the capacity to choose one's responses to difficult circumstances, became a foundation for rebuilding his sense of personal power. The vampire spawn, who had once been completely subject to another's will, had become someone capable of conscious choice, someone who could decide what kind of person to be based on his own values rather than external compulsion. The journey toward wholeness would continue long after the immediate crises had been resolved, requiring ongoing commitment to growth, healing, and the conscious choice to build something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. The person he was becoming through this process was neither a restoration of what he had been before, nor a simple reaction against what he had been forced to become, but something entirely new. Someone who had been broken and had chosen to heal. Someone who had experienced the worst of what people could do to each other and had decided to embody the best of what they could become. The future that stretched ahead was no longer something to be survived, but something to be created through conscious choice and deliberate action. The freedom he had won was not just liberation from external control, but the opportunity to discover who he truly was when given the chance to develop according to his own nature rather than someone else's design. The greatest victory over his abuser was not revenge but redemption, the proof that even the most systematic attempts to destroy the human spirit could be overcome by the choice to heal, to grow, and to love. And so we reach the end of Astarion's tale, not an ending, but a beginning. His story reminds us that even in our darkest moments, when we feel most lost to ourselves, there remains always the possibility of choice. The choice to seek help, to trust others, to reject the cycles that would consume us. In a world that often equates strength with dominance, Astarion's true victory lies in learning that real power comes from vulnerability, from saying no when needed, from choosing love over fear. As you drift into peaceful sleep, carry with you the knowledge that healing is possible, that freedom can be reclaimed, and that even the longest night must eventually yield to dawn. Rest now, knowing that tomorrow offers new chances to choose who you wish to become.